good evening to each and every one of you who are joining us for this, which is going to be a very, very special evening. I want to thank all of my brothers and sisters of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, the Trinity United Church of Christ, our community at large, and all of the you who have decided through connection with your family or friends, having heard about this virtual event. I want to thank you, and I hope you'll spread the word that this virtual discussion with our friend and our brother, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, who will be joining us in a few moments when we invite him into our conversation to discuss his new book, Dancing in the Darkness. This book is going to lead our conversation. I'm really excited about it, and I'm so excited that you have decided to make some time out of your very busy day. There's so many other things you could have been doing this evening, but we are going to have a very, very rich discussion. And if anyone knows the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, our friend and our brother, we know this conversation will take us all over our culture, our popular culture, our historical traditions as the African American church. So I'm looking forward to a very riveting conversation. I'm looking forward to you joining us. This event, this virtual book discussion, is occasioned on a very important day in our country, a day that all of us recognize as something that causes us all to reflect, to observe, and to take a very sobering look at where we are as a country and where we need to go and how far we have come, but how far we have yet to go. And that is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King national holiday, which is today. And I pray that you, in your own way, have taken some time to think about the legacy of Dr. King and how it has impacted you, your community, perhaps the work that you do. We know at the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, as we consider Dr. King's impact on our world, as well as our country and our community, we know that in our congregation, there's a very unique relationship, a very unique relationship that is connected to the civil rights movement, which our church, through the work of many of our members and pastors, we've had members of our church to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, members of our church to be on the Selma to Montgomery march, many who participated in the movement at various ways and in various levels were a part of that historic uh, time of change. We know that our fourth pastor, the Reverend Odie Hoover, himself was a member of the board of SCLC. He was a part of Dr. King's northern contingent of pastors who worked with him as he began to translate the work of civil rights into social and economic justice. Dr. Hoover also traveled with Dr. King to Oslo, Norway, Oslo, where he received and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. And so that relationship has been reflected in the many times in which Dr. King spoke at the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church. You should know the first woman to speak from the pulpit of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church was Coretta Scott King. So there's a long history of the Olivet Church going back to Dr. Hoover and continued with my predecessor, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr., who himself was a member of a part of the student movement in Atlanta. Also worked closely with Dr. King as a part of that student movement. He was a co-pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church under Daddy King and had a very personal relationship, both he and our first Lady Emeritus, Sister Edwina Moss, their family, and Dr. King. Dr. King married them. Dr. King actively had them a part of his work, both as a part of the SCLC and in Christian ministry and in parish work. So we have a tremendous connection in our church as we seek to embody that through all of our work in the congregation and in the community through civil rights, social justice, community economic development. And so it's only fitting that we would have an event such as this. And I'm really delighted that the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III would take time to honor us with his time on a fitting occasion like this. So we're excited about that. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about his connection, his family's connection with the King, with Dr. King, and the movement, because I'm sure it will come up in our conversation. But I'm going to ask just for a moment, if all of us would just for a moment in silent reflection, just consider and think and meditate on Dr. King and his impact and his legacy, which seems only right and true for a moment like this. Amen. Amen. I want to invite our very, very special guest here on today, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, who's come to share with us about his very, very special project that he has been working on. He's going to be joining us. And so I'm going to invite him in to be a part of this conversation. And there's so many ways that you're going to be able to participate in this conversation on today. Various ways that you'll be able to do this. First, let me say that this is being viewed on all of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church platforms. So I need you to help me get the word out. So whether you are checking us out on the uh, our Facebook, our Facebook page, the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church Facebook page, if you're using the Olivet app, the OIBC app, you can check that out as well. In addition to that, if you want to check us out on YouTube, check us out on Olivet Media. That's the Olivet media page on YouTube, Olivet Media. So you can check us out on that and spread the word. Send the message out to someone to let them know that Olivet is here. We're having our conversation with the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III as we discuss again his new book, Dancing in the Darkness. This book, you should know, is available. It's available in several ways. You can pick it up. OIBC, of course, we've been selling copies of the book, and we do have a few hard copies left. You also can pick the book up at Barnes and Noble. That's right, it's available at Barnes and Noble, as well as at Target. As a matter of fact, Target is featuring the book for the next several weeks through Black History Month. So it'll be a part of its featured book list doing that. And so we want to encourage you if you want to use Target, to pick it up. You also can purchase it on Amazon. You can purchase it on Amazon as well. And one of the things we're asking everyone to do in advance, to set your mind, if you purchase it on Amazon, you could really help us promote this book and get it into as many hands as possible by reviewing and commenting about the book. The more reviews and comments we can support Dr. Moss, Pastor Moss during this time, because that allows, through the algorithm, as I've been shared with, it allows it to spread it, continually create eyeballs to be able to see the book, promote the book, and to get as many people to consider it as possible. And if you had an opportunity to read this book, we definitely want to make sure that we get it before as many audiences as possible. Also, Afroware. There is a bookstore, a local independent bookstore, African American bookstore in Chicago, Afroware, which has a very special relationship with the Trinity Church. They are also offering the book at a 5% discount, a 5% discount. And so please support us as we try to spread the word of the message of who does not need to hear about spiritual lessons for thriving in turbulent times. And we're looking forward to talking with Dr. Moss about that. Please, I'm going to ask our team to invite and let him into the conversation so we can begin it shortly. I want you to know there he is. Hello, my friend and my brother.
What's going on, my friend, my Morehouse brother?
It's good to see you. It's
It is
good to see
wonderful to see you, Pastor Colvin, and thank you so very much for allowing me to have this conversation with the Olivet community.
Well, we're excited, and I want to say that not only are you sharing it with the Olivet community and obviously your home church, and as I always say, you are a beloved son of whom the church is very well pleased, but throughout our brothers and sisters throughout Cleveland and all of our platforms. And so I'm looking forward to us reaching as many people as possible. As I was saying earlier, this message in this book, which touches on a whole lot of different themes, particularly from both a prophetic and a personal standpoint, needs to be heard by a number of people. But I'm going to embarrass you just for a few moments because I've got to share for those who may not know our good friend and our brother. I think we ought to give honor where honor is due. So I'm going to share a little bit about Reverend Dr. Otis Moss the third. And so again, as we continue to do this, I'm asking everyone to spread the word, let people know that we're having this conversation on all of our multiple platforms. As a matter of fact, even before I introduce Dr. Moss, we will be entertaining throughout our conversation. There may be some interesting questions that you might want to share while we're having this conversation. So there are a couple of ways that you can do that. If you're watching on Facebook, what you can do is you yourself can comment on Facebook, and if you comment on Facebook, our team, which is a partnership today between the Olivet Institution Baptist Church and the Trinity team, they've really done a fantastic job working together to make this happen. They will pick up your comments on Facebook or on YouTube, and they will list those comments, and you'll be able to type them into the comment section. And as we hear some of them, we will, periodically touch on some of them as they relate to the conversation. But also, toward the end of our conversation, we're going to try to connect with as many questions as possible, so you'll have an opportunity to answer them. But let me share a little bit. So he would have an opportunity to answer them. But let me share a little bit about our friend and our brother. Dr. Moss is a part of a new generation of ministers committed to preaching a prophetic message of love and justice, which he believes are inseparable companions that form the foundation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, Dr. Moss is an honors graduate of Morehouse College. He earned a Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Chicago Theological Seminary. He also was named in the inaugural Route 100, a list of recognizers, which recognizes emerging and established African American leaders who are making extraordinary contributions. With a unique gift to communicate across generations, Dr. Moss' creative Bible-based messages have inspired young and old alike. His intergenerational preaching gift has made Dr. Moss a popular speaker on college campuses, at conferences, and churches across the globe. He is highly influenced by the works of Zora Neale Hurston, August Wilson, Howard Thurman, jazz and hip hop music, which comes out in the book in a number of ways. I'm looking forward to talking about that. The work and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the pastoral ministry of his father, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. of Cleveland, Ohio, have been primary mentors of his spiritual formation. He's also an avid and passionate advocate for the use of multiple media platforms in order to share the work in the ministry of justice. He's the founder of Unashamed Media Group, a justice-centered, faith-based agency committed to producing and curating stories to inspire the heart and the challenge the mind. He was the recipient of the 2016 Image Award for his work, which includes providing biblical context and theological support to a myriad of groups and causes. He is also the author of a number of other books: Redemption in the Red Light District, The Gospel According to the Wiz. He also co-authored the Gospel Remix, How to Reach the Hip Hop Generation, with three other contributors, and Preach, the Power and Purpose Behind Our Praise. I am delighted again to have our brother with us, and so we're going to jump right into this conversation. And so we're going to be hearing more from our friend and I'm just going to kind of push the conversation forward. Well, first, Pastor Moss, Otis, if I may say, um, one of the things that I found in my reading the book, it is certainly prophetic, but it's also very personal. It is, and that's a very interesting intertwining of narrative approaches in sharing. And so I'm going to ask that if you would kind of share the context and the inspiration of writing this book.
Mm, mm. Well, I thank you for that question because that was one of the goals. How do we talk about the personal and the public? From the reading of Howard Thurman, I love Howard Thurman, as you do also. And Howard Thurman would always share stories, whether he was talking his meditations, a sermon, or even his autobiography. And the book came about because there has been, I believe, over the last 20, 25 years, a spiritual itch that people are trying to scratch,
Yeah,
but they are scratching with the wrong tools. You have people scratching with social media. You have people who are scratching and saying, hey, if I can make money, and people thinking that money will save us, the market is the way to liberation, but yet we still feel empty. And there's a need to go back to the values, to the ideals that allow us to stretch, to grow, as Howard Thurman says, the crown that is placed above our heads that we will spend the rest of our lives growing tall enough to wear. So I was hoping that the book would be a way for people to stretch and to grow toward the crown, knowing that we'll never reach the crown, but hopefully day by day, as we reach and search these issues and these values, will be a little taller.
yeah. The story of the book really begins in a moment of kind of interesting intersection between kind of the politics of the day and the kind of the beauty of an innocence and creativity of your daughter. And so, if you could talk a little bit about the inspiration for the title, "Dancing in the Darkness," which I really found really appealing and fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah. Michaela is the inspiration for the title, and I might add, I had a joy doing the audiobook. Michaela came with me when I did the audiobook, and she read the dedication page. So the show, it was a father and daughter opportunity for to do the audiobook. But it was in 2008 when I was just starting as pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ. And there was an individual in our congregation by the name of Senator Barack Obama, who was running for president at the time. And he eventually became president, obviously. But when he was running for president, there were conservative pundits that attempted to take a portion of my predecessor's sermon and use that to create some controversy, especially among the conservative community in America. And I remember the first time that I had encountered it, and what some people don't realize, I was pastor doing all that, and yet they were promoting the fact that Dr. Wright was pastor, but he had been gone for quite some time. So here I am, I'm working out, doing my warm down. I think it was called Bally's at the time. I think it's been since purchased by another company. I'm on the treadmill. Someone taps me on the shoulder, said, "Hey, Rev, is that your church on TV?" And I looked up and I see Hannity is going insane about the church. And I said, "Oh, I think I need to leave." And so that began the gauntlet of where we witnessed 40 outlets show up to our church every Sunday on the sidewalk. Any person who was going into the church, they were throwing microphones into the face
Mm,
of individuals. It
mm,
even got so bad that when we would have altar call, there would be people who were in the congregation that would come to the altar, kneel at the altar, and try to record or raise questions to people
mm.
when they were at the altar. Then we started receiving death threats. Dr. Wright did, I did, the church collectively did. We had to hire security and bring in bomb sniffing dogs every time we had worship. And I had personal security, and I'm always having someone follow me around. And I didn't get much sleep for about a year, because it was always the question every time I would run into someone, is this the moment? Is this the person that's going to attack me? My body was ready and I was filled with anxiety. So one evening, we had fallen asleep. Well, I was trying to sleep. We heard some noise in the house. It was late in the evening, and Monica tapped me and said, "You need to check that out." And so I grabbed my rod and my staff that comforts me. And that was a Louisville Slugger. And I went around the house and I'm thinking, this may be it. I am prepared physically. My body and the adrenaline is going, that if someone is in this house, I have to protect my family.
Mm,
I hear the noise again, and it's coming from my daughter's room. And I go into my daughter's room, and there is Michaela, all 5 years old, standing in the middle of her room, and she's dancing, spinning around in circles, saying, "Look, Daddy, I'm dancing. Look, Daddy, I'm dancing." Of course, it's 3 a.m. I have to preach in a few hours, and I get that fatherly voice, "Baby, you got to go to bed right now." And the spirit spoke as she's still spinning, "Daddy, look at me. I'm dancing." And the spirit said, "Look at her.
mm,
She's dancing in the dark. The darkness is around her, but it's not in her." And at that moment, I scrapped my message for the morning, went back to my study, and I wrote until the sun came up.
mm,
I stepped into the pulpit at Trinity and I said that we're called to dance in the darkness. The darkness is around us, but it is not in us. And if we learn how to dance as a community, dance as a nation, we can see a transformation in this democracy, that God, as scripture says, will turn our mourning into dancing. And the beautiful thing about darkness is not that the sun has forsaken you, it's simply that the earth has turned away. But if you keep dancing, eventually joy will come in the morning. And that's what the title of this book comes from seeing a little girl dance, and as she danced, she taught her father in the process.
yeah, you described that scene during 2000, during the Obama period, and it just seems like the days have gotten only darker, right?
Mm,
Have only gotten darker, and you always had a keen analysis of kind of the times in which we're living, and I want you to just kind of look in the darkness right now. What are we looking at right now? When we look into the darkness and with January 6th, the kind of the continued efforts at voter suppression, the continued fight
mhm,
for justice in our criminal justice area and police reform. Talk to us a little bit about the darkness, and we'll talk about the
mm,
schools. But what are we
mm.
looking at when we look at the darkness that has overtaken so much of the nation?
We're looking at a mutation of a continual virus that we have been dealing with in America, better known as white supremacy.
Mm,
White supremacy is a viral agent, and viruses mutate. So it mutated from the moment of 1619 through 1860, 65. And then it mutated again during Reconstruction. It mutated again post Reconstruction. It mutated again during this Jim Crowism and lynching. It continues to mutate. And in order for us to deal with this mutation, we first have to be truth tellers about the root of the virus. And that idea of white supremacy is destructive and cannot in any way function at the same time with the idea of democracy. And so we have to one tell the truth about it. So what we're seeing now is a continuation of the Southern strategy, the
mm,
Southern strategy that was specifically designed when the Dixiecrats left the Democratic Party and moved into the Republican Party and began to plot, beginning in 75 with Nixon, when we had the beginning of what we know as the mass incarceration era. It continued with Reagan and the breaking down of consumer protections and the stepping back from protections around voting, because it was Reagan who started, he starts his entire election, he kicks it off in Mississippi, in the same city where Goodman, Cheney were killed. He did it intentionally and spoke about what? States' rights. Anytime you hear states' rights, you're talking about someone using coded language to say that we want to marginalize Black people. We want to marginalize people of color. We want to marginalize women. And so the forces that have been drinking from the Confederacy were starting back in the 70s, plotting for today how to change the Supreme Court. This is a long game that we're dealing with. And so we really are probably roughly somewhere in, if it is nighttime in America, it's somewhere between 11:30 and 11:59.
Mm,
Because if it's midnight exactly, that means it's the next day. But we are not yet in the next day. We are moving toward a moment where a new day will come. And so it's very important that we become students of history and students of the strategies that have been used to marginalize Black people. And the current form of the Republican Party, as it sits today, is really a mutation of Confederate ideology from the period of the antebellum South.
wow. You know, it's interesting that your response to meeting these challenges, you draw on the spiritual, what you call the Black spiritual tradition.
Mhm.
The Black spiritual tradition, and typified or exemplified, obviously, best exemplified in Dr. King. And you know, you kind of lift up this intersection between the vibrancy, theology of the Black spiritual tradition and the principles of democracy, kind of this intersection between them where people like Dr. King probably, again, best were able to weave them together in a very artful way. But we know other traditions and other people within the Black tradition also did that. But talk a little bit about what you introduced very early in the book, which is this intersection between the Black spiritual tradition and democracy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question that you raised because it should be noted that the expansion of the American democratic experiment and project, its expansion has been directly related to its relationship of Black people being resilient and resisting. With three of the amendments, 13, 14, and 15, is because of our work. But if you even move into talking about women's suffrage movement, they were examining the abolitionist movement and then got support from Black women to move into what we know as the suffrage movement. The labor movement is directly, again, connected to Black people. Every time Black people push for full agency in this country, it always benefits everyone because we're never isolationist in our rhetoric nor in our project. So everyone benefits. The fact that we have laws on the books now that support people who are differently abled, that you got to have ramps that go into buildings, is a direct connection to the freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s. Whenever we look at the rights that people have in America, you can make a connection in reference to the work, resiliency, and resistance that comes out of the Black tradition. That we believe that not only we are children of God, but that everybody has the mark of the sacred upon them and should be able to bask in the possibility of flourishing fully as a human being.
Again, I want to share all of our friends. We are discussing the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III's new book, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times. Pick it up on Amazon, uh, Afterware, Barnes& and Noble, Target, everyone. We really want to promote this message and get it out. Also, we're already receiving comments in our discussion feed. And so if you have a question that's related to any of Dr. Moss's responses or something that you think might add to the conversation, I want to invite you to do that. You know, Otis, Cornel West, has a quote He says that justice is what love looks like in public. And um, in addition to the Black spiritual tradition, uh, you go into the scriptures and you look at this notion of agape, right? This
Mhm.
notion of agape love and what it means and its implications. And, always when we're discussing love, there's always this idea when you're kind of critically engaged it from a rational standpoint or pragmatic standpoint. What does love look like in social policy? What does
Mm,
love look like
mm,
as it translates to
mm.
legislation or initiations and initiatives of elected officials or of our government leaders. So, you kind of touch on that from a biblical standpoint and begin to push it into the conversation of the public square. And for our listeners, I think, or for those who are joining us, it'd be interesting to hear your take on this notion of love as kind of a public ethic.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, you touch on exactly what we're attempting to do. That it is a public ethic. So the idea of love within the public space, I would say from out of the spiritual tradition, it would be red letter love, meaning Matthew 25, what you do to the least of these in a public space. That you're giving Jesus is giving this public ethic in terms of how you are to engage. So what does that look like? One of the best examples is the idea of restorative justice or redemption over retribution. That
Mm,
we have retribution as a definition of justice within the American context. So we have to punish. We seek vengeance, but we don't want to restore. We use the rhetoric of restoration, but we don't want to restore someone.
mm,
But yet, love requires, when it is married to justice, that someone needs to be restored. Someone needs to be taught. I mean, for example, if you're playing basketball, there is an example of this idea of justice or restoration. If I'm hit, then I get a free shot. It's called a foul shot. If I'm playing soccer and I'm hurt, then guess what? I get a penalty kick. And in the action, the entire team then says, you know what? Because you fouled X person, we now want to collectively work with you so you don't do it again because you're going to hurt the entire team in the process. We can't use you in this game if you continue to function in that way. So, if we were to translate some of the simple rules that we even use in sports, we would have a better justice system. We have a justice system that phonetically is pronounced incorrectly by policymakers who use the word just us instead of justice.
mm.
And so we need to create the kind of space of restoration. And that only comes when you believe that people are sacred, when you believe in human potential, when you believe in flourishing, when you recognize, as Howard Thurman stated, he said it was transformative for Black people to recognize that we are children of God, that we are loved by God. Then that means that we functioned in a different way and engage the world in a different way. Our policymakers must come to that realization that every child has worth and is deserving of an education and food and housing and to be protected.
You use the example of sports in hockey and in basketball. One of the things that I have to say that there's a saying that we say among preachers that favor is not fair. You have this unique ability to rock both the pen and the mic in terms of your ability to kind of connect some very profound ideas in very simple terms, but terms that truly do kind of embed it into our consciousness to understand, okay, this is a reality. We see this play out in other arenas, but we don't see it playing out in social policy. We see it playing out on the sports field and on the basketball court, but we don't see it playing out in the reckoning for centuries of racial injustice. I want to talk a little bit about the impact, right? You touched on the impact that the pressure of the the attention, the negative and far
Mhm.
right wing extremist attention that had taken hold over of the country, and how it was having impact on your family, your congregation, and the like. Um, and it's interesting. You also in your book lift up as a quote Carl Jung, who's a depth psychologist, and I want to kind of segue a little bit into the ongoing impact of white supremacy and negation of opportunity for Black people, and all of the residual effects it's had on our mental health, our families, and our just sense of well-being. The challenges are so unique that we are facing right now, but they are rooted, as you pointed out, in this morphine of this virus. They're rooted in the same biases, the same prejudices, greed, hatred, and thirst for power. But unlike previous generations, this generation is not as deeply rooted in those spiritual traditions that you say are the very forces or tools or instruments to beat back, not only from a social justice standpoint, but from a mental health standpoint. And so, I think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and you touch on that as well. And I think about some of the stories that we have heard, that I've heard, read, as well as seen reported of how many activists wrestled with the pressure of leading these movements, and how it led to many to have challenges with their own mental health, and we've seen that play out even in the movement in the 1960s, the way that the pressure of was against them impacted their personal lives, their mental health, and all of those things, and the effort to rebuild their sense of wholeness. And so, talk a little bit about that kind of what how this lack of the spiritual traditions
Mm.
within this generation, it's to our disadvantage, because it really does provide both the social tools, but also the psychological tools of esteeming and affirming just our existential being. Just talk a little bit about how does the spiritual traditions that we've drawn on help meet that personal, psychological, and mental onslaught against these forces of darkness.
Yeah. I think the question that we have to raise for this generation, or and put forth for them, is where do you go when you are broken? Where do you go when you are bruised? And the challenge that we face and this generation faces with the heavy critique of faith institutions, and there should be a critique of faith institutions. This generation has a critique. They're not anti-God, they're not anti-spirituality. They have a heavy critique, and maybe anytime anti-institution, suspicious of institutions.
Mm,
But when you're suspicious of institutions, when you cast aside certain organic spaces,
mm,
you also lose the ability to have to be refilled for resilience. So some churches may not have a Black theology of liberation, but they did have a spirituality of keep on keeping on. They did have a spirituality that could refill you and encourage you
yes.
even when you were at your lowest moment. Now
Yes.
remove that and say, I'm going to do this with my friends
Yeah.
and people who have the same ideology as I do. And you find out that they don't have the depth, because there's some wisdom
Mm,
you can't get from a book. There's some wisdom that a workshop will not give you. There's some wisdom that you have to go and sit on mama's porch to receive. There's some spaces where only a quilt wrapped around your body and then someone cooking the right food and then laying hands on you telling you it's going to be all right, let me pray with you. And so what Black faith spaces also give an opportunity to is not I wouldn't say strangers, but people who are not deeply connected to you, who also want to see you thrive, can come around you and lift you up. So that's what happened in the 1960s when people were utterly depleted. There, and I'll give a prime example, a wonderful story of Vernon Jordan when he was an interning for Attorney Hallowell, who was the primary attorney in Atlanta, who worked with Constance Baker Motley, who essentially did the cases that would essentially desegregate part of Georgia and the Southeast and so on. They went to Brunswick, Georgia, Jawanza, because there was a Black man who was on death row who had been accused of raping a white woman.
Mm.
And the NAACP was not allowed into Brunswick. It was illegal to be associated with the NAACP. I know people love to say, well, that's more of a just kind of a moderate, not super progressive. Being a part of the NAACP could get you killed.
That's right.
So Vernon Jordan, Hallowell, they go to Brunswick and they were invited into someone's home, as you couldn't stay in a hotel. So they were staying in someone's home. And Vernon Jordan tells this story, and it was so powerful because he was saying this was the power of Black resiliency, Black church, Black spirituality. They're at the dinner table, and they had prepared this feast. This family had prepared an amazing feast because the family said, we know you're going to be up against some major evil. Fill your belly first.
Yeah.
And they sit at the table, and the father prays, and his prayer was this: Lord God, we are thankful that the NAACP is in a place that it ain't supposed to be.
Mm.
Lord God, we're grateful that they're here to fight for us. We are thankful. And Vernon Jordan said it broke him down into tears because here was this family in this rural area in Brunswick, Georgia. He said they didn't realize what they were doing for them, how they were pouring it, and they lost this case. This man was eventually killed by the state on trumped up charges. But Vernon Jordan says that it was one of the most transformative moments of his life, that this family that he only met once poured into him and to the premier legal scholar of Georgia, Hallowell, and it changed his life. Now, if he didn't have that, when you don't have those moments, when you don't have those people, when you don't have praying saints around you, instead of critiquing them, just recognize that some people don't need to be on the front line. Some folk just need to pray for you and sometimes just put their arms around you. That's also work for liberation. And we need to, your mental and spiritual health is important. And we have to share with this generation. You ain't got to come to church, but we want to create spaces so that we are supportive of your actions. We can put our arms around you, that when you are bruised, when you are bleeding, the saints are going to help put bandages on you so that you can fight on for another day.
One of our friends on Facebook says they love your chapter on consecrating chaos. And I'm wondering, is this a way of consecrating our chaos? And what are other ways that we can do that?
It is, that's actually one of the chapters I so enjoyed writing, was consecrating our chaos, because chaos is continual, but it requires us to pause. And one of the aspects of deepening our spirituality is not giving a list to God, do, but is learning the power of silence and pausing and gratitude and finding the the laws, the laws of spiritual physics. Just like if you're on a sea with a sailboat, you've got to know the laws of the wind and the waves in order to sail. You never sail directly. Every sailor knows you don't sail directly. You sail this way. You got to catch the wind, and you've got to catch the currents appropriately so your boat doesn't turn over. And what keeps your boat from turning over is the rudder and the keel of the boat that balances everything out. And so that's what we have to do in the chaotic moments is what's rooting us, number one. Two, can we pause enough and slow down enough to be able to catch some of the spiritual laws that are floating around us so that we can reach our particular goal and consecrate the chaos. Know that it's chaotic, but it's not going to break us. Know that it's chaotic, but yet there are some laws that are operating here. And I'm speaking of spiritual and physical laws that we have to engage.
For all of our listeners, particularly those at Trinity and at Olivet, who know and have read your books previously, or had the privilege and the blessing of your preaching ministry, we are very familiar with how you can connect all of these things. And so, for those who are not familiar with the preaching gift as well as the writing gift of Dr. Moss III, I want to share with you there is not a wasted page in this book. He finds an illustration or a metaphor to connect it, and it is literally dripping with one way to connect it. And if that way doesn't connect, whether it's sports, whether it's music, whether it is some commonplace event in your life, as well as history, culture, popular music, it's all there. And so I find that it allows people to find a different door to enter into this discussion about dancing in the dark, in the darkness. Um, you know, the book really gets into a very difficult moment in your congregation's um, ministry and life with the story of Joseph Graves.
Mm,
His death was a tragedy, and unfortunately, it's an all too familiar sequence of events in our communities. Um, but you talk about rage and the potential for rage, and this whole idea of reworking our rage, redirecting our rage, um, and the potential for rage um, to turn into revenge, and you create this space where you put into conversation these streams of Black resistance, um, uh, the nonviolent direct action tradition, the Black church, the Black power, and Black nationalism, as we deal with the rage. James Baldwin's said to be Black in America is to be in a constant state of rage.
mhm,
um, but you put them in conversation, not as history has tried to put them at opposing poles, or dueling for the loyalty of Black people. But you put them in conversation, and so talk a little bit about that of how we individually and collectively have responded to the ferment of rage as a
mm,
result of the things we have experienced and we continue to experience as a result of being Black in America.
mm. And I love the Baldwin quote. It's actually one of my favorites, and it's true that when if you are a Black person, if you're relatively conscious, you you're gonna be in a rage all the time on so many levels. And Baldwin took his rage and directed it on the page. And
Mm,
so he redirected his rage and had a specific outlet to be able to say, all right, I want to do something with all that I'm feeling. And the spiritual challenge is to know that, rage is something that will happen in the human spirit. It's going to happen. The feeling that I want something done right now, the welling up in your spirit that I want vengeance at this moment. And it satisfies. It's kind of like Gardner Taylor talks about
mm,
cotton candy religion. He says if you eat some cotton candy, it'll fill you for a second, then you realize you don't have any nutritional value and you're hungry all over again. It just dissolves in your mouth, and you want more and more and more. And so when a wonderful young man was murdered in our congregation, and unfortunately, he's not the only one who was murdered in our congregation.
Mm.
Multiple stories, but I'm thankful to Joseph's family for allowing me to share their story, which really is, I think, the story of so many young men. Yeah, he led our one of our drill team at church. He also was a part of our mime ministry and led that. He was highly involved, but he also was in the city of Chicago. And when Joseph was killed, it hurt us, and all of us wanted something to happen. Me as the pastor I was like, you can't do this to us. Jojo is our man. We love Joe. Everybody loves this brother and loves this family. But we knew at that moment that our young people, because there were lessons, street lessons that was being taught, that we knew we had to act quickly. Otherwise, it was going to escalate. And I'm so grateful to many of the people at Trinity who have been involved in what is known as the restorative justice work, what they call peace circles, bringing young people together, which is a West African and indigenous American strategy of dealing with your pain, so that you can be in a space where there is no judgment, where you can use whatever language, and nobody can say, don't use those words, where you can say specifically how you feel and what you want done right at that moment. And our brothers who are part of the Rites of Passage program put our young men in a peace circle. And they said, without any edits or any beeps, what they wanted done. We needed them first to speak that truth. And we need to know that they were in a space that they were safe and that they were loved and all of that. And so we then had to help them create some action that spoke to the energy that they were feeling. And that action was a march. That action also was a Kickstarter campaign. They came up with it. We didn't. The church didn't do any of this stuff. All we did was we were trying to just, protect and manage some things. A Kickstarter campaign to raise money if you have information on Joseph's killer. And they raised $12,000.
Wow.
Teenagers. $12,000 to say that if you have information, we want to make sure that this person no longer is on the street. But then there were rituals that were happening that you have to be aware of things that go on in your community. The young people wanted to have one of these quote unquote ceremonies where you come and you leave these teddy bears at the spot someone was killed and whatnot. Really dangerous, because with the advent of social media, someone will put out there and say, I know who did it. And then all of a sudden it becomes viral, and we end up convicting someone, and they're proven guilty without any type of trial. And so that was out there. We were worried that there was going to be major retaliation. And we had to walk through with a lot of our young people about not to retaliate, because they had had experiences with the police. So we were teaching them. One of the things that the stories that one of our, I believe it was Willie in our Rites of Passage program, shared with a young person about rage. And it's not in the book, but it's the prime example. He says, you need to operate like Muhammad Ali. And the young are like, what are you talking about? He said, Muhammad Ali, when he had someone who he knew was stronger, he knew that it hit harder, he said, I've got to get in their head. If I can get them in a rage, then they will lose all ability to function with boxing technique, and I can win the fight. He said, Willie was sharing the story basically to say that when you're in a rage, you lose your ability to make decisions that will allow you to be victorious in the long game. in the game of resilience, resistance, and eventual liberation?
I want to keep those questions coming. I see there are a couple of questions that are starting to develop on our on our comments section. Here's a question from um, uh, Daniel Teresa Guest. With the ever growing rise of Black middle class churches that cater to prosperity, how as a pastor do I navigate this possible spiritual waywardness?
You know, there are, and I'm going to probably receive some comments on this. There are churches with Black people, and there are Black churches. And the
Hmm.
history of the prosperity quote gospel, interestingly enough, though some people immediately go to Reverend Ike, it it is not out of the African American experience. It's something that was picked up, and because Black people were extremely great communicators, white, evangelical, Bible school, or I shouldn't even say evangelical, um, educated, or I should say trained, these particular ministers to put forth these particular ideas. And it becomes important for people in ministry
Hmm.
to root themselves. And there's a great book called Righteous Riches that gives the history of prosperity gospel. And you realize, oh, this is in the Black community. They recruiting Black people because Black people were extremely good communicators to share this idea. That it becomes important for us to root ourselves in a beautiful tradition that allows for human flourishing. And prosperity ministry fits very well with American market capitalism. And I like to say that America is not Christian, it is just capitalist with ecclesiastical garments at times. And we need to be clear that this is not the tradition of Jesus. We need to be clear and communicate that though you turn on the TV and you may see a prosperity preacher or a prosperity church, but that's not the norm of the Black church. Most Black churches have 75 people and have three families in that church, and are small storefront spaces that do a lot of elder care, family care, covering of people in small ways. There's just not that many mega churches. It may see everybody want to act like they are, but there's really not that many. But the most of the churches are those small storefront churches where people are being cared for. The place when grandma can't pay her bills, that's the church that's paying the bills. The space where auntie it just got put out of a home, that's the space that is bringing someone back into a home where they can live. So we've got to begin to tell the truth of our own tradition and not let another tradition, let someone else get the mic and tell us that this is the tradition. They may have Black people, but it doesn't mean that they're a Black church.
We are talking about dancing in the darkness, spiritual lessons, and thriving in turbulent times by my good friend and my brother, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss the third. Otis, one of the things also that I think that you explore, one by just writing the book and the nature of your writing,
Mhm.
and your willingness to be so personable, and to be so transparent. I think that there are three areas that African American men or men in general have to confront, and that is the issue of accountability, being accountable, um, responsibility, being responsible, and vulnerability, being vulnerable. And I think you accomplish that by opening yourself up to share um, so many stories of yourself and your relationship with your family and your church. There's a certain transparency and an openness that I think benefits all of us. All of us who are willing to see how important that is in communicating not only a story but our story in a way that can touch someone's heart. But you examine Black masculinity in this book, I think, in two ways. And I mentioned the first, by just your sharing of yourself in the book, but also in some encounters that you've had um, with sisters within the congregation who have pointed out some your own short-sightedness or your own unconscious biases, or at least how you were presenting or articulating some ideas. Let me ask you this, because you also talk about in the book some conversations that you've had with your wife, as well as some of your colleagues. What have you learned from your daughter, Michaela, your wife Monica? Shout out to Monica, Elijah, and Michaela. But what have you learned, particularly from the women in your life, as well as women in ministry, as it relates to confronting our beat bias, as you
Mm.
entitled the chapter in your book?
The beauty and the power of listening, of truly listening and being in partnership with someone and being accountable for what you do and what you say. And I just major shout out and love to Monica, who is my partner and who is my teacher and who has helped me on so many levels to realize you looking at that as a dude. It's like you need to look at this from the perspective of a sister, the weight that a sister is carrying simultaneously, and the societal weight that a sister carries. Said, we're in partnership. I'm gonna call you out on it, but we're in partnership. And having that kind of partnership is important. And I learned from Monica and from my mother and from my grandmother, from Monica's grandmother, from these amazing sisters that I've had in my life, like my sister, that it is important that if you are to do work, ministry, if you are to do any type of activity that seeks to allow human beings to flourish in the manner in which God demands, you have to have a crew, mentors that are not your gender. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on 50% of all the human population and understanding of what they struggle with. And having voices. Now, I didn't mention the names in the book, but when I tell the story about when I made a statement and I realized how biased I was being, it was really my good friend, Reverend Tracy Blackman, who called me out.
Ah,
Tracy's like, Otis, now there's something wrong with, and I was like, oh my gosh, Tracy, you're right. And she just laughed at me. I mean, just flat out. She said, we love you, but what you just said was very biased. And I was like, man, thank you, sis. And I love Tracy to this day, because she rooted the critique in love. And I have just such great respect and appreciation for her because of that. She didn't cancel me. She's like, oh, you clean that up. You can do better than that. I mean, it was just real simple. And having those relationships are important.
hmm, yeah. You one of my favorite chapters as a comic book DC Marvel fan is the chapter entitled, well, just the chapter title alone, challenging our origin story. I love that. And I think about most of the origin stories that we see in comic books emerge out of tremendous trauma.
Hmm.
They emerge out of tremendous trauma, and obviously, in our community, there's so much trauma in our community, um, as a result of policies, hatred, um, the objectifying and the reducing marginalization of people because of the color of their skin. Um, and the thing about trauma is that it's not easily the cycle of trauma is not easily broken. If it were, I don't we would not be having so many conversations and having these discussions. But you um, present this notion of challenging our origin story. Challenging is it? Um, So talk about what is an origin story and what are the keys to reworking one's
Mm.
origin story, both as an individual, but also as a country.
Yes, yes. The origin story idea in the book, as you mentioned, draws from comic books. That there is no true hero, and there is no villain, actually,
Mhm.
until you understand and walk through the origin story. Batman, his parents are killed, but that's why he's anti-gun, because his parents were killed with a gun. Uh, Spider-Man, his uncle is killed. He could have stopped the murderer, but he said, "It's not my problem. It's not my issue. I'm not involved. It's all about me." And he realized that I have to have a broader sense of doing work. It's not about me. It's about the wider community. If you really want to get like nerdy, like Martian Manhunter out of the DC, comic universe, is the last of his family, the last of his tribe, and he feels called to make sure that what happened in on his world will not happen on the world of human beings. Rick, I talk about Rick Grimes and Storm and all of that, but there is no hero until one there's a self-examination. And one of the things I love about the story of Storm, for those who are comic book nerds, not watch the movies, but the X-Men who are comic book nerds, Storm is an African hero, number one. Number two, Storm had powers, but she was being exploited on the streets of Cairo by people who thought, well, we could use your power so we can steal. It's not until
Mm,
she goes out into the savannah, the African savannah, and she meets a prophet,
mm,
and that prophet teaches her that mentor-mentee relationship. And our origin stories can change when we are willing to submit ourselves to sages of wisdom. It may be a physical person that you actually know. It may be someone that you read and ends up blessing and changing your life for forever. So you see your life in a different way. Every villain and every hero has the same origin, but it's a matter of how the story is told that determines whether they will be hero or villain. So we have to find spaces where we find those sages, where we're self reflective and we do not see our life as a victim, but we see our life where we can consecrate the chaos, as I say, where we can rewrite the origin story, and then we can walk out into the world and use the powers and gifts that we have been given to help transform and bless other people.
Want to ask you, my friend, what is prophetic grief
Mm.
and how do we practice prophetic grief?
Prophetic grief is grieving with a sense of I want to change what is going on. It is grieving that is honest about my pain and the history and what has happened, but I won't sit there. I also raise the question of how can I be used? Use me, Lord, is prophetic grief. Prophetic grief doesn't seek absolution. If someone does an injury, that within America, America's always want to get black folk to give absolution. We need to forgive everything and forget. No, no, none of that. Forgiveness is a within the context, spiritual context, is not about me releasing someone from accountability. It's a demanding accountability, but releasing yourself from that person having control over your soul. That's what forgiveness is within the prophetic Greek grief context. There's a lot of pathetic grief
Mm,
where all we do is we we weep, we cry, we are angry, but it stays the same. But prophetic grief if we use another story, is what Frederick Douglass did. Frederick Douglass said, I have a responsibility and I refuse to shut my mouth until I see my people free. Prophetic grief is the grief that Harriet Tubman had when she was hit with a 3-pound weight in her head. But she said she fell into a trance that the Holy Spirit spoke. And as a result, she knew she had to free other people. She saw the pain, she saw the tragedy, but at the same time, she reworked the story so that she could grieve and recognize that pain, that tragedy, but say, I'm going to be a part of a solution so that those who are not yet born will be blessed from my action.
Mm. This idea, very early on in your sharing on prophetic grief, you touched a bit on this idea of pardon, which is one of the final chapters in your book, Parting Our Dust, which really examines this notion of human frailty. Um, um, Human beings build institutions, human beings have ideas, human beings pass laws, and if uh, human beings are inherently flawed, that means there is a flaw in every idea. There's a flaw in every institution. Every law has a blind spot.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, many people who are caught in the blind spot of so many of the flaws of our ideas, whether that is um, the inequality of women through the Constitution or the disenfranchisement of African American people, many people suffer because of the inherent blind spot of our humanness, particularly as it relates when we try to um, build out a civilization. And so many people obviously have been hurt as a result of the human blind spot. And only when our vision has broadened have we been able to see uh, not only who we've excluded, because sometimes we knew intentionally who was being excluded, but seeing in that full panoramic view also their own humanity. But many people have been hurt by the system, by institutions,
Mm-hmm.
um, by the nation as it holds the very same constitution that enfranchised, also disenfranchised, and gave license to oppress. Um, as a spiritual, as a spiritual discipline, pardon and forgiveness. How does pardon play out in policy,
Mm.
in the ongoing democratic experiment? How does pardon play out in um, our current political and social milieu?
Mm. Mm. It's a value that America is yet to embrace. When someone is released from prison in this country, they are still a prisoner. They are still a prisoner because there are a variety of things that they cannot do. Certain places they cannot live, certain jobs they cannot have. And if you're in the wrong state, your citizenship is permanently removed.
Mm,
You cannot vote. You served your time. Imagine if we, in basketball,
mm,
if in fact someone had an infraction and they were permanently removed from the NBA. We would think that was absolutely insane. But yet, the way we structure policy for people who are incarcerated, we continue to keep them in some form of prison even after they've been removed. And it's solely for profit, and it's solely to keep certain people elected.
mm. I'm gonna end on this notion of hope, this idea of hope. Um, what's your definition of hope?
Hope, for me, the idea of hope is wrapped up in it's more of a poetic piece. It's wrapped up in the laughter of children, in the arms of elders. It is wrapped up in the idea that we have a choice every day that we wake up. A choice whether or not we will serve and listen to our better angels, or we will hang our heads and say, I will live in cynicism for the rest of my life. It is the fact that we have a choice. And just as our ancestors, who to me give the most beautiful aspect of hope, can you imagine enslaved Africans in 1789 on a plantation outside of Beaufort, South Carolina? 30 women and men make a decision at that moment and stare at the overseer and say, "Oh, freedom, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be with my Lord." To me, that is an act of hope when they say that I have the choice to choose what my life shall be. When we take hold of the idea that God has given us an opportunity to choose, hope comes alive. When we know that every time a child is born, that God is saying, I haven't given up on you, and there's the possibility of liberation and transformation. When we sit with elders who can look back and see more than we have seen and share stories of triumph, we find hope. Hope is all around us if we're quiet enough to be able to witness it speaking.
For the last hour, we have been discussing Dancing in the Darkness, spiritual lessons for thriving in turbulent times by Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. And if you've not already purchased this book, I am sure by the end of this conversation, you will have, and you will want to, and you'll want to share it with someone else. There was a question that someone asked that they were looking forward to part 2 of your conversation or your discussion regarding the origin story. But I'm going to tell them, get the book. If you want the other part of that, it's in the book. And so, my friend, I want to thank you for this time. I can't thank you enough. This, in the spirit of Dr. King and what this day is supposed to mean for us. This really reflects that to the best way that we could have done it as a community. And so you could have done this with anybody across the country, but to do it with your Olivet family, I really, really appreciate this. Many of you, some know, Trinity knows and Olivet knows, but again, we might have some folks who are new in introducing our friend to them. He loves music, he loves culture, and so I'm going to end this on a light note. What's on your playlist?
Oh man, I appreciate you asking, man. I've been listening to Snarky Puppy's latest, which is a wonderful piece, along with NASA's King Disease 3, which is also a wonderful, powerful piece. And I've been going back and listening to some of the old Clark sisters, because when you listen to some of modern gospel along with modern R&B, you realize that the Clark family has shaped the way not only choirs sing, but also the way that music is arranged.
Wow. Well, that's quite an eclectic group of people on your playlist. And if anybody knows you, that's about right. That's about right. Listen, I'm gonna ask, man, that you would pray us out and have the final word. But I want to thank you for this time. It's really been a blessing. Would you pray us out?
Yes, thank you so much. Let us go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we are grateful that you are at work around us. If we can just slow down enough and witness your beauty and your grandeur, speak to us and use us. May we inhale what you exhale,
Mm,
that it may fill us in such a way that we may be able to serve just another 24 hours. We thank you and ask your blessing upon the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, upon Pastor Colvin and his family. We thank you for the many stories that come out of Olivet. We thank you for the Trinity United Church of Christ and the connection between these two congregations, Chicago and Cleveland. And may we all continue to work together that we may get into some good trouble in
mm,
2023. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
amen. Thank you, uh, Pastor Moss III, and thank all of you for joining us. God bless you and have a wonderful evening.